medianoci. E poi è tipo la campionessa mondiale di burlesque, una cosa del genere. A mettersi in forma di sì, no, tutta chittata non è figa.
Non sta a trasmettere.
Non mi diceva francese, quella che la sera prima era. Ah, infatti a me piacevano tutti.
Mettimi un po' la camera da quell'altro cuore 50.
Non si può restare su. Mazza, blu Ah, ci stanno le luci spente.
Quello di qua?
Ah, c'è ogni po' il master? Un po'?
Ok, vabbè, rimetti a...
Sei come blu qua. Però lì come si vede?
Ma la camera dici?
Ah, perché ci stanno le luci spente?
Sì.
Ah, ok, ecco. Ha ripreso colore, ha ripreso vita.
Ok, perfetto.
Pure la corrente ha ripreso vita. Sì, e zanzari.
Vediamo qua, riprovo un attimo che Maria su OBS.
C'è qua test audio 1 2 3 prova. C'è qua, mazza come satura. Oh.
Un po' la mandata?
Sì? No, ma posso abbassare pure il canale da qua. C'è qua test 1 2 3.
Va bene così? Lo lascio a zero per io.
Avete provato pure l'audio di CC?
No, soprattutto prima di non mangiare.
Nel caso, domando un attimo
Audio PC però è sempre video, no? Io ho questo canale qua e
video
basta.
credo che ma non l'ho fatto.
Ecco, a posto. Lasciala là, quindi tocca ridargli l'HDMI. Questa canzone mi fa pensare alla Tecnomini, eccolo qua. Questa canzone è della Tecnomini. A me mi modula.
Ollie came from Miami, FLA. Hitchhiked away across the USA.
Alleanza anti-thread, il primo che capita.
E quello è video. No, aspetta, se c'è 1500 video ci mette un botto a caricare. Aspetta, io vedo.
Capoccione. Ecco, vedi, mo tanto te si chiude.
Uomo di poca fede, avevo detto non lo chiudere.
Ma che fanno questi che è?
NATO Foundation, Africa, fame, cazzi, ma...
Non ho preso, l'ho seguito.
Hai seguito?
In che lingua? Parlavano in arabo. In inglese. Ma parlavano tutti
Ma
in
invece... iPhone? Che ti serve?
Ce l'ho io il caricabatterie per Samsung.
No, se qualcuno aveva un telefono con un Mac nuovo, quella USB-C.
No, con USB-C no, non me l'hanno manco portato qua.
Ce stanno questi con USB-C.
Però non mi hanno portato la USB-C.
Ottimo.
USB-C sti computer?
Questi c'hanno USB-C.
Allora dopo devo fare un
giù me li provo. Ma come ci sto?
No, è per prova. Così guarda, mi mando pure
La Phantom ce l'ho.
PPT fuori.
In teoria dovrebbero parlare.
E riprovo pure un attimo. Tu c'hai spazio ancora nelle schedine?
C'ho 160 minuti in una e 287 in un'altra.
Prova, prova, sa, prova. Prova a test 1, 2, 3, prova. Prova a test 1, 2, 3, prova.
Test 1, are you light?
Ok, perfetto. Non so se gli puoi dire dalle impostazioni che quello può essere in ingresso o in uscita. Cioè tu dici di utilizzarla come scheda d'acquisizione? Ah, beh, sì. Cioè io, è come la mini DisplayPort del Mac, no? Che tu c'hai... Ah, penso di sì. Tipo Emanuele ha comprato per i Mac nuovi questo qui e c'ha una scatoletta dove tu c'hai sia le uscite HDMI, VGA, c'hai le USB e si costa tipo una settantina di euro, il grigio.
Io ho preso solo quello fatte online.
C'ho pure i braccioli, ma sono signori oggi, Vengono a passare subito la roba?
Io gli ho detto a Simona e due. Qua se finisce mezzogiorno e mezzo, se mangiamo una cosetta e...
Bomba. Perché volendo si dobbiamo pure smontare tutto e poi te ne andiamo a mangiare.
Proprio così. L'unica cosa mi ha chiesto Alessandro che alle 2 vengono quelli di domani. Ma veramente chi ci sta a fare domani? Ah, c'è stai te?
Che cosa? Io?
Carissimo mio, veramente desidero presso la nostra voce il giorno 10 maggio sono a richiedere il servizio di tutto, un assistente tecnico lavorato alle 17 persone, basta. Comunque perché ieri non è che cazzo mi ha scritto per cliente, dice fammi capire che cazzo è questo. Attrezzatore solo per il 10 maggio, sistema counter con 2 monitor 17 voti, un microfono girato, un microfono pacchetto, 4 PC portatili, 4 microfoni fissi. Allora, abbiamo tutto di questa roba, tanto il mixer, no in realtà non so se col mixer lo faccio riportare via e gli rimetto quello loro, del pacchetto di Playback Pro, che c'è quello originale, quello craccato bene, che è fighissimo. Puoi cambiare pure il background, le cose. Perfetto, ora ti mando solo i microfoni che mi hanno mandato.
Ah, mo comincia, eh? Sul 9?
No, sui canali quelli di premium che stanno su Sky.
Ma perché
No,
io
ok.
non li vedo? Tutti mi vedono. E niente, io ce l'ho il pacchetto cinema, ma ne vedo. Ma non è che ci deve avere HD. Io c'ho il pacchetto cinema, però ne vedo sti cosi premium che hanno messo qui. Non li vedo. Cioè mi sono rimessi quelli che c'avevo di Sky Cinema e va. Allora la domanda è, non è che ci deve avere il pacchetto HD per vederli?
L'intrattenimento non ti compaiono su...
No, se tu vai sul menu e vai sul cinema, il pacchetto HD no, io c'ho cinema, là c'è il documentario, perché è il pacchetto pure per i cartoni nero, eh sì, paghi mi pare 5 euro, 7 euro in più. Questo giorno vado a vedere, non è fare sti cazzo dei cosi premium, ma niente.
No, riprovate che poi si collega. Chiudi là e metti Roma Eventi
Stavano
senza
le cuffie
lettere
pure a loro,
maiuscole
giusto?
Sala Sollini e rimetti
No,
la
io con la
password.
Pellini stavo perché è più diretto.
Invece no, mo io sto su Roma Eventi e ci sta tre tacche,
Gebril,
piena.
Taddale Maru, Bizue,
Sto su
Rob
Roma
la
Eventi tutto
Ressula.
scritto minuscolo. È sempre Alibert 5.
Io la metto prima a lui
Questo c'è.
perché parla prima Chidane, Manin.
E allora ti
Si
lascio
parla prima
pure
loro.
il distributore HDMI, che se
Questa
ci
troppo,
rimanda diretto al PC del counter, lo porti giù e distribuisci il monitor.
Sì, vengo anch'io che devo fare.
Sti due monitor in teoria servono per counter, non so, penso così almeno sta scritto là. Questo è quello che mi ha scritto Daniele Perdiero.
buongiorno.
Allora, ho fatto 2 PowerPoint. Siete felici?
Molto.
Allora, l'unica cosa, praticamente questa sessione qua non dovrebbe seguire quella di questo programma, ma dovrebbe seguire questa, cioè del
Che è
programma.
diverso?
No, è giusto l'ordine, poi ce n'è uno in più. Però, perché ci sono stati questi cambiamenti ieri al momento, non so se loro seguiranno questo, quindi in linea di massima dovrebbe essere questo l'ordine. Poi regolatevi voi, se qualcuno parla prima o dopo poi lo vedete. Quindi questo. E ora, i 2 PowerPoint, allora uno sta qua.
Sì, Leo, perché qua in realtà dalla mail leggo, chiedono un assistente tecnico, ma forse perché verranno, da quanto ho capito, alle 2, infatti se questi qua vede un attimo a livello tecnico che c'è.
Ah, no, questo è già sera, scusa, sono 2000 Grobbelar. Eccola la prima, sì.
Adesso cerco il nome del portiere del Liverpool da finale dell'84.
Per chi ricordi?
Quello che facevo scemo, ma visti i rigori della finale. Faceva il proprio.
Ah, pure, capito?
Sì, faceva
Ma
il...
dai.
Si apre tutto a posto, no?
E poi solo questa qua?
No, e poi c'è un'altra chiavetta che si proprio sua,
Ah, ok.
la mia.
10 5 attivi.
Domani, no?
Gruppo editoriale di Volpi Valentini.
Ma che è sabato e domenica l'evento?
Tu hai detto che ero da là.
Alle 14, scarico presso il teatro, il church? Ah no, 12:30 pure io.
2 cabine, un impianto di lezione, 100 ricevitori, un tecnico di
Security e sì.
videoconferenza tramite MacBook Pro, scarico solo 15 minuti.
Cioè il proiettore è solo per la
Ma
videoconferenza.
tu ci capisci come c'è no,
Questa qui...
videoconferenza, quindi ci sarà pure una telecamera.
Allora, sa Gibril che fa introduce tutti, poi parla lui.
Si chiama
con l'ordine.
videoconferenza.
ma questa qua...
Quanto lo scrive?
Ah,
quanti scatole dei microfoni ci stanno qua sotto? Sono tutte piene?
Ci sta pure i body pack con gli archetti.
Tutta roba sempre da rimandare indietro?
In realtà sì, però vedo che c'ha pure un archetto Leo domani. Cioè questi ormai non mi mandano una lista di...
Dobbiamo vedere oggi.
In realtà oggi dobbiamo smontare la traduzione, il mixer audio, ci abbiamo i 50 pollici giù che ci stavano l'altro giorno, sgabelli e blu stampanti. Il resto rimane tutto montato.
Per domani, il setup di domani.
Le?
Il setup di domani sono questi quattro.
Il setup di domani ci dovreste avere 4 microfoni che non sono quelli, stanno lì al desk, ci hanno portato sempre i 4 e 18, e 4 PC per VR50
C'è il monitor.
e sti due monitor dove c'è la camera.
L'altro che ce l'ha?
Ti ripeto, questo è quello che mi ha scritto lui, mo io da Paolo.
Devo collegare a Roma Eventi con la RL grandi o Roma Eventi piccoli?
Io al piccolo sto andando una bomba.
La password di Roma Eventi.
Alibert 5A.
Alberto.
Alibert, questa è via Alibert. 22 di ping e 7 di download. Ah, il programma di Tailoring.
Alberto con la grande.
No, 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 tutto piccolo.
Ah.
Me la mandi? No, mandala sul gruppo. Ah, su quelle Cracovia, era quello mandato su Taipei. Sì, sì, mandala su Cracovia che ci stanno tutti. Cioè, se non sono usciti, poi non lo so.
Commenti su Roma Eventi. Sparisci, lo fa, sparisci.
Non ho visto ieri in Francia hanno fatto la finale di Coppa Nazionale, ovviamente il Paris Saint Germain, e in finale è arrivata una squadra di terza categoria.
Ha vinto la squadra del
No, no, 2-0 però.
La so
Cioè
giocata.
come te qua che cazzo ne so, gioca con... non so chi sta in Serie C.
Albino Leffe.
Marco.
Ertrava.
Ah, sì.
Lecce.
Eh? Puoi formattare pure le pennette per me questo. Tanto sei te che primo video. Io faccio il nome tuo. Ah, quella mia, fammi vedere un po' che ci sta.
Ma voi l'avete visto Pupo, sta fatta dei ieri? Pupo.
Mi sono addormentato.
Dovete vedermelo, come è stato?
Allora, praticamente ho visto la partenza. Secondo...
Strafatto di che? L'erba? Ah.
E gli hanno fatto fare un buon...
Tipo il mago, che era quello là? A Amsterdam, quello che è nato contro gli ieni. Il mago di Elma.
Può essere. E dopodiché gli è venuta la fame tossica, l'hanno fatto nella gelateria e si è mangiato
Un chilo di gelato, che si è preso?
la marijuana. E per tipo 5 gelati alla marijuana è andato iniziato a dare i numeri davvero.
Ah, i gelati della marijuana.
Chiamate qualcuno, sto per morire. Poi, cazzo.
che poi volevo dire,
Mi è presa malissimo, ho detto chiamate qualcuno, sto per morire, lo sento. Sta arrivando le mie prime. Che pazzo.
sì, perché poi non aveva mai fumato neanche un sigaretto. E poi l'hanno pure lì,
Ma chissà quanto l'hanno pagato per fare capito? Invece una volta, non mi ricordo dove l'ho visto. Delle vecchiette che hanno avuto 40 anni. Se ne sono andate ad Amsterdam e hanno fumato la prima volta in vita loro. Sono divertiti. Sono divertiti.
Oh, she say, hey baby. Du, 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 du. Mazza ha fatto 50... no, 2 milioni e 9 di visualizzazioni. Sta canzone. Io vado a portare giù i gelati. Oh. Lo fai finire da finire la lavoro a te. 20 minuti per fare la visualizzazione. A Milano si vede la visualizzazione. Sì.
Poi io a casa
Thank you.
Oh, I thought that's different. Ah, okay. This water and some. This is water.
It's not special
Special.
water.
It comes like special, you know.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. First of all, let me seize this opportunity to say that I am really glad and honored to be among such a very distinguished group. And I would like to seize this opportunity to extend my thanks and appreciation for the invitation I received from my good friend, Ambassador Alessandro, and his very skillful team. The discussion yesterday was a very rich discussion, and I thought we start this session by injecting some few remarks. Maybe it will add some meat to the discussion which has started yesterday. First of all, I thought demography will be the name of the game for the 21st century. And demography was missing from yesterday's discussion. World population will increase by 33% by the year 2050, which means we have more than 2,400,000,000 people will be added to world population by the year 2050. Out of this number, 1,300,000,000 will be in Africa. According to the UN statistics, no less than 359 million young Africans will be marching north looking for jobs by the year 2050. So if you just count in your Coast Guard to stop this flood, you better count your bullets. This is the first remark. Demography should be taken into consideration in strategic context, especially if we look at the fact that Europe, by the year 2050, will be shrinking from 740 million, it will be less, into just 728 million. Romania, for instance, will shrink from 20 million to just 14 million. So we have, these are facts of life. This will be the most crucial driver of history in the 21st century. And we better look at it carefully. Two, the question of partnership should be devoid from any psychological legacy. Africa today is not Africa of 100 years ago. So when we look at Africa, we look at Africa with a population which is more educated, population which is more aware of world politics and world state of affairs, a population which is well connected through the phenomena of connectivity, which is the core of globalization today, well connected to the world. They dream the dreams of any young people in any spot in the world, and they have the same expectation. They are well connected. So this should be taken into consideration that Africa today is not Africa of a century ago. So we are looking at a completely different generation. Three, if we don't look at the African-European relationship from a strategic point of view, both continents will be losing. I'm not exaggerating if I say that the destiny of our civilization, starting from 2050 until the end of this century will rest mainly on the future of Africa. Africa will be a case of make it or break it. Just let us look at the fact that by the year 2050, none of the European countries, with the exception of Germany, will be among the 10 biggest economies of the world. The 10 biggest economies will be completely non-European economies with the exception of Germany. You're going to have China, you're going to have Brazil, you're going to have Mexico, you're going to have South Korea, you're going to have India. So Europe better rethink this whole paradigm of African-European relationship. The Mediterranean will be either a sea of connecting two civilizations, or it's going to be the divide between two civilizations, or what I might call the clash of the Titanics. Therefore, I would urge the distinguished panelists and their presentations to look at the African-European context from a strategic point of view. Last point before I start giving the floor to our distinguished panelists, the Africans themselves. Probably it's about time that we stop looking north. Maybe we should look at each other. We have some successful stories today. Economical growth in Ethiopia, economical growth in Rwanda. These are success stories, especially if we look at Rwanda, which came out of a civil war and today is one of the most promising economies in the continent. So Africans, they are not a liability for world civilization. Africans have a lot to offer to today's civilization. So we better revisit this whole paradigm of the African-European relationship. The issues of illegal immigration, of human trafficking, these are just symptoms of a much, much deeper problem that we should look deep into it. Having said those quick remarks, I will start my panel by giving the floor to our distinguished panelists. Please keep in mind that each panelist will have 12 minutes, and you better use your stopwatch. Try to save some time for the discussion period, because what you cannot say during your presentation, you can add it during the discussion time. You have enough information about each panelist in the booklet which was distributed yesterday. So I'll start by giving the floor to Mr. Mahari Tedeli Maru, the lead member of African Union High Advisory Group, Addis Ababa. Please, Mr. Mahari.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Mohammed Jibril. And also, I would like to extend my appreciation. I have pressed the time. It has stopped actually counting, unfortunately. So I will briefly read my remarks. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a delight for me to speak in this important meeting, and I would like to thank the organizers, particularly the president of the foundation, Ambassador Alessandro, and his colleagues, including those from NATO Defense College, for this invitation. And when I read the title of this meeting, Africa in Action, I first misread it as Africa in Transition. In my sincere opinion, currently Africa is in transition, facing a dichotomy of despair and hope between African pessimism and African optimism. And transitions are often characterized by unpredictability and volatility. Interventions from within Africa and outside Africa will determine the course of those transitions. Let me limit myself to three major current transitional issues as to why I think Africa is importantly and determinantly in transition. These are recent changes in the developmental governments in Africa, the AU reform and its promises, and the new competition in Africa by global and regional powers, which we discussed yesterday to an extent. Let me start with the third major issue. The global and regional powers are now back into the global strategic competition in Africa. China has spread its tentacles all over Africa, including the AU and regional economic communities, and earlier and quieter. The AU is struggling on how to sort out its partnership to catch up with other partners. USA just woke up and is attempting to unseat and deter China's expansion in Africa. NATO aims to mend relations with AU after the political difference emanating from its military intervention in Libya. Significant others, such as Russia, Japan, Iran, Turkey, Israel, India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar are trying to establish political and economic alliance within Africa, including using military and financial capabilities at their disposal. For example, the maritime domain, such as in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea Strait, including Yemen, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, are becoming a battleground in this strategic global competition among high powers and significant others. Military camps are being established in Sahel, Horn of Africa, and Western African countries. So much so that Djibouti, for example, is now called the military real estate of big and small powers purchasing land adjacent to each other. This looks similar to the strategic interventions of global forces in Africa during Cold War. The difference rather is clear. Now there are many networks of global actors, not two blocks only, West and East. The two most significant ones are not fighting for ideological dominance. It is rather for economic dominance with potentially with diplomatic and military implications and implications for the global order. And most importantly, unlike Russia, China is not attempting to remove the ladder the Second World War has established. It wants to be at the top of the same ladder. Needless to say, threats to peace and security have local manifestations, but they also have increasingly global implications. Megatrends, which our chair of this session has mentioned, in trade investments show that Africa has become increasingly attractive with expanding opportunity for foreign actors. Change in global power structure, that has been mentioned again by the chair, is already and will increasingly bring Africa economic and political governance to the forefront. The rise of China as economic diplomatic influence, the attack on liberal democracy in its traditional base in Western countries has brought an end to the political and economic dominance of some powers in Africa. Global economic structural changes are expected to bring significant changes in Africa, particularly through the availability of affordable African labor and market. It's clear that global changes will play equal, if not more, role in the transformation of Africa. This takes me to the second point regarding the ongoing continental reform at the African Union. Africa had several opportune times for reform. With the end of Cold War, antagonistic global strategic interests in the world powers were withdrawn from Africa for a while immediately after early 1990s. The withdrawal, even if short-lived, offered African leaders an opportunity to seek and institutionalize what we call African solutions to a variety of African problems. The AU Constitutive Act, the African Union Constitutive Act, shifted the mission and vision of OAU mainly from organization of anti-colonial and anti-apartheid solidarity to that of more interventionist and integrationist African Union. President Paul Kagame, speaking about the reform he is leading in his acceptance speech as elected chairperson of the African Union in January 2018, said, I quote, "We are running out of time We must act not now to save Africa from permanent deprivation. Scale is essential. We must create a single continental market, integrate our infrastructure, and infuse economies with technology. We have to be functional. We have to stay together. This quote encapsulates the need for focus and the need for reform of AU, and has three key messages, which are the theme of the reform. First is the urgency to save Africa from permanent deprivation. Second, the relevance and functionality of the African Union and the need for organizational reform, particularly the AU Commission. And third, creating Pan-African scale of economy through integration and attracting external markets. For the AU reform to set Africa out of, or to put Africa on escape velocity out of deprivation, these are very important reforms to be had. And in this regard, in order to fulfill this unique and important reform, states are at the center of this reform to bring delivery, inclusivity, legitimacy, security, and resource mobilization, which are critical. And in this regard, the AU has initiated self-financing of AU, which is crucial for the reform to succeed. And currently, 23 member states of Africa has already started the process of contributing to the African Union budget. And the self-financing is hoped to change the partnership dynamics that exists, including with European Union, AU, UN, and NATO, and other partners that will come to the African continent. Consequently, AU reform agenda should transform this partnership. In recognition of drastic increase in partnership, the AU has developed what is called the Banjul formula that differentiates and aims to guide all partnerships in Africa. The AU Commission has established African Strategic Partnership Division under the Bureau of the Chairperson. The ultimate aim of such partnerships in the eyes of the AU is self-reliance by building capability for Africa to provide peace and development for and by itself. And partnerships need to avoid capacity substitution, which is existing now, and addiction to aid based on principle of mutual respect of mandate. This takes me to the third change Africa is facing now. At national level, Africa is facing significant political and economic changes in the past few years. Most of the changes are happening within what we call dominant developmental parties. Changes of leadership with the ruling parties of ANC of South Africa, ZANU-PF of Zimbabwe, EPRDF of Ethiopia, BDP of Botswana came without any legal problems, without also election processes. They are rather outcome of intra-party struggle, influenced, shaped, and in some cases demanded by popular and populist movements. Changes have happened also in MPLA of Angola, even through election. Similar demands for change may occur in other countries, such as Nigeria, Algeria, South Sudan, and Sudan itself. While these changes are received euphorically by many, it's far from clear if changes will last long and bring significant departure from the past. Fast changes of cabinets have forced some of us to consider if the Italian type of unpredictable coalition politics is setting in Africa. The challenge of such government volatility is happening without the required strong democratic institutions and culture of coalition politics in Africa, risking instability of the state. Such long drawn-out internal struggle within the governments and political parties may undermine the single-minded focus of governments required for fast-paced delivery necessary to maintain the velocity of Africa to escape permanent poverty. Thus, for Africa to be more stable, transformation needs to outpace crises. But the requisite capabilities of states to predict, prevent, respond, and adapt to transformational challenges are yet to be fully developed. they also require effective and stable governments. While the presence of more than 110,000 UN and AU peacekeeping troops in Africa and thousands of military forces in different parts of the continent illustrate the peace and security challenge in Africa, nonetheless, all factors of the problems in Africa are fundamentally linked to two factors: poverty and bad governance. Some crises could always require rapid military intervention, but there is no crisis in Africa which will be permanently resolved through military intervention or peacekeeping. Ultimately, socio-economic development and good governance constitute the most human and cost-effective tools to prevent conflicts. Finally, reform of AU, changes at national level, and partnerships with Africa cannot succeed without a capable African state in the continent. Such states are fully dependent on other actors, including national political mobilization, economic forces, and international partners. Hence, the focus should be both at national politics, developmental economics, and global partnership. The AU reform agenda hopefully will deliver all those, but only with the help of partners like NATO, EU, and Italy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mahari, for sticking to the time frame. Ms. Nima Ogruplaro, do I pronounce it right?
You're very close to right.
Okay.
Like the soccer player, Grobbelaar.
Ogruplaro, okay. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so if I can just have the pointer. Thank you very much for this very kind invitation to this beautiful city, and really my very sincere thanks to Ambassador Alessandro and his very gracious colleagues who made my visit possible today. I must say, when I received the invitation, I was a little bit trepidated because I'm actually an economist and I'm talking in a forum that is dominated by security specialists. And I thought for a moment, is this the right place to be? And then, of course, I looked at the topic. And the topic really talks about what is relevant and important today in an African context. So let's start. Just very quickly about the institute that I represent. I work for the South African Institute of International Affairs. It's an independent foreign policy think tank that's based at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And we work towards this common goal, or this very, I think, aspirational goal of a well-governed, peaceful, economically sustainable, and globally engaged Africa. We have 4 key research areas that we cover at the Institute, mainly Africa's foreign policy, its economic diplomacy, governance, and sustainable development. So, when we look at the intersect between economic development, progress, and governance in Africa, I think we're well beyond the framing of a human security approach. In fact, I think it's important to adopt a normative framing that goes beyond the idea of freedom from want and freedom from fear to one of a broader aspiration of sustainable economic prosperity in Africa. And in fact, that's been one of the key tenets of the South African government's approach to its engagement in its own region through the prism of its African agenda. And I think it's very well captured in the context of former President Nelson Mandela's words of South Africa cannot prosper in a sea of poverty. And I think more broadly encapsulated in the UN approach that there can be no peace without development and no development without peace. So let's look at what was our starting point. Africa's past. And I really like this, this graphic that we have here because it in many respects shows what I think literally in one snapshot what some of the key problems and challenges have been in Africa. So if you look at the top line, that really shows the production of oil, so the very rapid increase of oil production in Angola over the period 1991 to 1999. And at the same time, the lower line that you see there is an indication of the Human Development Index in Angola. And that really tells us a very important story to us. So at that time, in this period, life expectancy at birth was 42 years old. Now, if I just look at the room that we have here today, that's literally 2/3 of people that would not be in this room today. That was really the situation in Angola. And during this period, we've had civil war since 1975, since Angola achieved independence. There was a temporary ceasefire in 1991, war resumed in 1992, and only in 2002, a peace agreement was signed after the death of Jonas Savimbi. And now we have to ask the question, where is Angola today? So Angola is Africa's 3rd largest economy. And it's very interesting to look at what's happened with the human development indicators here. So the first one, life expectancy at birth, one would expect that that would have increased very significantly. But in fact, life expectancy at birth in Angola today is 52.7 years. So in this period, over the last 18 years, or less, over the last 16 years, this is the improvement that we've seen in the Human Development Indicator. Adult literacy has increased substantially. So from 42.1%, it's now 71.1%. Per capita income has increased substantially. It's now $6,900 per year. But we're talking here about massive inequality still remaining in the country. So what changed? How did the picture change in Africa? At the end of the Cold War, and this is really coming to the governance context, only 3 countries in Africa, so 3 out of the 53 were democracies. By 2013, only 4 did not have multi-party constitutions, and they were Swaziland, Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. By 2018, there's a very tentative hope that in Libya we will move to multi-party elections in 2019, but there's also concern about what that will mean, because we understand today in Africa that elections don't necessarily solve governance problems. Elections can actually cause greater instability in many African countries. And in Somalia, at the end of last year, they started the process of beginning to register political parties with a view to hold elections in 2020. So there are only 2 countries that have one-party systems today in Africa, Swaziland and Eritrea. So what happened in the governance landscape? And this, to a certain extent, I think complements my colleague's presentation. So at the end of the Cold War, we had the introduction of multi-party democracy in Africa. And literally a wave of change swept through the continent. In 1994, we had a full transition to, transition to full democracy in South Africa. But it was also a period where there was enormous instability in Africa. So we had, in 1994, actually, the Rwandan genocide occurred. In Europe, we saw the very violent breakup of Yugoslavia. And that led to 2 things in the global normative framework around governance. First of all, the introduction of the principle responsibility to protect, and also the establishment of the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court in particular was very, very important, because what it did is, for the first time, it directly addressed impunity and unacceptable behavior by heads of state. In this period, we also saw the Organization for African Unity reformed into the African Union, and really the outright rejection of violent change of government or coups in Africa. And that really signaled a very fundamental shift in the African context. We also saw around the millennium, I think, one of the best examples of intra-regional cooperation in Africa with the formulation of the new Partnership of Africa's Development, a process that was led by Thabo Mbeki, Bouteflika, Abdelwad, that basically, and Nigeria's Obasanjo, that basically tried to completely redefine how Africa engages with itself and with the rest of the world. And during this period as well, we saw the very important development of the introduction of the African peer review mechanism. This is a self-monitoring process developed by African governments. It's a voluntary process, and it self-assesses governance in Africa. And it takes a very, very broad perspective. So it looks at from political governance and corporate governance to socio-economic governance. In many respects, actually a precursor of the SDGs. So let's look. So does this mean actually a great and wonderful picture in Africa? In fact, it doesn't, because as I mentioned earlier, the consolidation of democracy in Africa is very, very difficult indeed to achieve. And if you look at, for example, Freedom House's assessment, we still have major challenges in the region. I've just been given the red light, so let me speed through. And in fact, what we see here is governance in Africa is a meandering river, rather than a rocket that has taken off. I think in particular, one of the big concerns, and this is looking at the Mo Ibrahim Index of Governance, is that we've seen, looking at, perhaps this graph is much more useful, we've seen improvements in sustainable economic opportunity in Africa, we've seen improvement in participation and human rights, and we've seen improvements in human development. But the one single trend line that has gone down is safety and the rule of law. And I think we just need, if we look at that period, if we just think about what was happening in Africa at that time, what was happening in CAR, what was happening in Burundi, what was happening in Libya, what was happening in the DRC. I think there's a very sound reason for why that is in fact the case. So let's very quickly look at the economic outlook. So I think two things really happened in changing very fundamentally the way that the economy has grown in Africa. First of all, with the political changes that swept through the continent, we also had the introduction of many more economically minded leaders. We saw the liberalization of economies throughout the region. We saw the crowding in of investment into the region, and all of this, was a very, very positive story. Traditional Western investors started moving into the continent, but I think the big single issue that fundamentally changed the way that Africa positioned itself in the global economy was Chinese demand for commodities, and that has really spurred enormous growth in the region. So in this period, sub-Saharan Africa's economy quintupled from over the last 20 years, from $300 billion US dollars to $1.6 trillion, and it's expected to increase to $2 trillion by over the next 2 years. I won't go too much into the rest of it here because I actually want to come to some of my recommendations. If I may skip through, you can have a look. just very quickly to point on this issue, projected population growth that our chair mentioned right at the beginning. And what are some of those? So what is wrong with the picture? Even though we've seen enormous economic growth in the region, we've also seen rising inequality. We've actually seen rising poverty. We've also have experienced a phenomenon of jobless growth, in inverted commas. That means that we're not producing enough jobs to absorb, especially young people, joining the employment ranks. So I want to perhaps end with these two slides. The one, with the indulgence of the chair, if I may.
Okay, we are done now.
Very quickly.
Okay.
So this slide basically raises two issues. What are the most important concerns for Europe? The most important concerns for Europe when they think about threats in the world is immigration, terrorism, the economic situation, and the state of public members' finances. And only then comes unemployment. Let's look at the next picture.
No, the time is up.
Okay.
Time is up.
I hope that in the question and answer session, I can
thank you
talk
very
a bit
much,
more.
Ms. Neem.
Thank you.
Mr. Michel Sola, floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, and thanks to the NATO Foundation for inviting me today, and especially my dear friend, Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, who has always a special talent to detect issues of importance in today's world. And I think this conference is right on the spot because I think Africa is at the heart of the challenges of tomorrow's world, and I think it's very important we can discuss. And for me, dialogue is very important. You know, we may disagree, we may have different views, but the fact that we are all together with such distinguished speakers coming from Africa is very important to exchange views and to see how we can design a way forward. So I will make some points and I will try to be brief because I think the exchange and the questions and answers session will be more important. But I've come here to present a bit what NATO is doing because yesterday in the sessions I get the impression that you know, NATO's role is a bit unclear. Maybe first because NATO has a deficit in communication and people don't get exactly what NATO is doing, especially towards the South and Africa. But also because we have very different things, you know, and all this is not seen as a kind of a logical whole. And this was underlined yesterday by Mr. Amrani in the second session, you know, where he asked this question to say, but we have the Mediterranean dialogue, but we have, you know, the African Union, and what is NATO really, how does it bring all this together? So I will try to answer this. And it's clear that NATO has woken up to the challenges of the South. This is one part of the work that is being done now in view of the Brussels summit that will take place in Brussels on 11th and 12th of July of this year. So it's called the Framework for the South, and this indeed was a bit rebalancing, you know, in NATO between, you know, all the big work NATO is doing in terms of reassurance, you know, vis-a-vis, you know, the Russian threat after the annexation of Crimea. And so wanted to say that, of course, we are reinforcing our eastern flank, but we have also policy towards the south. So that's the gist of this framework for the south. This was endorsed at the Warsaw Summit in 2016, and today nations are trying to put meat on the bones, as we say. NATO has also launched an initiative called Projecting Stability, which means how NATO can, you know, cooperate with countries beyond NATO territory. So this is another initiative. And also at the Warsaw Summit in 2016, we had, you know, an agreement of heads of state and government to enhance our cooperation with the African Union. So all these are very important blocks, but it's a bit of bits and pieces. However, you know, if we look at the African Union and NATO, member states face similar challenges. You know, our chair mentioned these challenges, you know, at the beginning of this panel, and it's clear that we have to counter violent extremism, we have to tackle uncontrolled migration, And it's clear that, you know, NATO and the African Union have a lot to do in common, you know, to address these challenges in the future to project stability. So there's a lot that's possible, you know, to achieve. And we have to go down that road. It's clear that, you know, the Brussels summit in July will be very critical to lay the foundations. But my main message in this first part is that at this moment, NATO has a Mediterranean dialogue, which is lots of work with countries of the Middle East and North Africa region. And in this, Ambassador Minato Rizzo was one of the person that laid, you know, the foundations of this Mediterranean dialogue, you know. We have, as I say, the framework for the South. We have the Projecting Stability Initiative. But the problem now with all this is to see Africa as a whole, as was said yesterday, and to connect the dots. I think it's very important that... You cannot hear me well. It's better? So, how is it now? Now, okay. So, sorry for this. So,
you want to start all over? Or?
No. I will save people from a repetition of what I said, you know. But my point, as I say, what's important in this first part is to connect the dots, to have all these different blocks, and to connect them together, because Africa is a whole, and we have to work with Africa as a whole and as a partner. And I will now explain a bit what we do with the African Union, which also responds to what my friend Mr. Maru said in his introduction also, because we worked together on this in the past weeks, and I'm sure we have lots of work to do also in the near future. So we have started with the African Union already in 2005, where we provided strategic airlift to the African Union mission in Darfur. And this strategic airlift has then been expanded to strategic sea lift also. And this we've been doing every year. And after Darfur, we extended that to the African Union mission to Somalia, which is today the biggest African Union mission to date. And this partnership, you know, to extend, you know, NATO's air and sea lift to the African Union has lasted for 13 years. So it's not since yesterday. So there's work being done and a confidence that has been built at working level with the African Union. We have signed in 2014 a technical agreement to lay the basis of our cooperation, and we have a small team, modest of course, but still about 10 people in Addis Abeba. And what's very important, these people are embedded in the Peace and Security Operation Division of the African Union, which means our people work side by side with the Africans. So it's not just, you know, people being in a bubble and coming for a meeting from 9 to 10. It's people working with the Africans, you know, at the same desk, answering their questions and having interaction. That's very important in my view. That's the way I see it. That's cooperation. And of course, you know, we are providing what we call mobile education training teams to the African Union. This has been increasing. We had 1 in 2016, 2 in 2017. We have 3 planned for this year. And this happens in domains that are of interest to the African Union, because there again, our work with the African Union is request-driven. It's not us saying, we will now explain to you how NATO is organized. The Africans don't care about that. What we are doing is, for instance, you know, help in logistics, because, you know, the Africans have now built this fantastic logistics base in Douala in Cameroon, but they have a problem because they don't have the know-how and the knowledge on how to prepare an inventory, how to know what they have in terms of capabilities. We can help them because we have software for that, we have knowledge, and this is the kind of things, you know, where we can be of benefit to the Africans, you know. So these mobile education training teams is also a very nice concept, because instead of saying to the Africans, you will come, you know, to a training in Oberammergau, you know, in Germany, which is maybe nice, but it's far away, we go to them, you know, and so it means the people don't have to waste maybe weeks of work. They can just come next to their work to have the training, you know. So that's also a very important way to work together, you know, with Africa. Then, of course, we have subject matter experts, you know, these ones that are embedded in the African Union, and I liked a lot because Mr. Maru mentioned maritime security, and that's a domain also where we want to cooperate with the African Union. In Lomé, there was this big Africa strategy for the sea, the 2020 maritime strategy, and in this NATO can have a contribution. We've worked, of course, of the Horn of Africa to counter piracy, but we have a big knowledge in terms of maritime security, and on this, I think, with the AU's knowledge, we can benefit a lot from each other. So those are the different lines of action we have, with the African Union. We also support the operationalization of the African Standby Force. It was also mentioned that the African Standby Force is making progress, but it's not there yet. And there NATO also has a big knowledge, in terms of building, forces, because that's our job. And so in this, we are providing lots of planning expertise to the African Union. So, just to say for you, for the questions asked yesterday, NATO is doing things with the African Union. NATO is doing things with the North African countries through the Mediterranean dialogue. NATO is doing lots of efforts of capacity building. So I'm not here to be the propagandist, but just to state facts, and to just relativize, between the impression that NATO is doing nothing and the impression that NATO should do everything in Africa, which is, of course, completely impossible and not wishable. There are other actors. At this moment, it's very important because we have a window of opportunity with Africa. In the past years, we had, and some mentioned it, and I can come back in the questions if someone want to challenge me, we had the Libya cloud, I would call it. This Libya intervention that has cast a cloud on the relationship between NATO and the African Union. And so this was one of the stallers of the process of rapprochement, of cooperation between NATO and the African Union. But, in addition to that, we had a chairperson, Madame Zuma, who was also very anti-NATO. And so in the past years, our cooperation at practical level, which I just described now, has been, slowed down because there was no political will to reinforce it. These days, with Mr. Faki, the new chairperson, who has a peacekeeping experience, who is more keen on cooperation with NATO, we have a new momentum. And this was shown, earlier this year in February, where we had a high-level official visit to the African Union for the first time since 2010, and where we were received, by the deputy chairperson, Mr. Quarti, and very high-level officials of the African Union, where we heard everywhere the same message: the African Union wants to re-engage with NATO. So this is a different political momentum, and I think we have to seize this opportunity. In the follow-up to that, we had in April of this year a very good seminar, with very high-level officials from the African Union, and the delegation was led by Mrs. Diop. She's a special representative for women, peace and security for the African Union, but she came there also to represent the chairperson and to represent the Peace and Security Operations Department. So it's a sign of real high-level involvement by the African Union vis-à-vis NATO. And this, in my view, is a very good omen, for the future, for better cooperation. So now we have a list of proposals we have devised in Rome, because it was a workshop where we were very productive together, and we had a very good and lively dialogue. And so now we are examining this, to have a kind of roadmap on what we do with the African Union, and just to mention a few things: how we can support African Union peace support operations, how we can help even more the operationalization and sustain the readiness of the African Standby Force, how we can support efforts in counterterrorism, how we can work together on counter-improvised explosive devices, which is a big problem in Africa, as we know, and also how we can help, on building integrity, because we know the rampant corruption in Africa, and also the question also of women's peace and security, because the question of women, and their integration is very important also for the future and for the peace and stability of the world. So this will be the basis for our future cooperation. Also to say that Commissioner Shergi, the AU Peace and Security Commissioner, has been invited to address the North Atlantic Council in the coming weeks. So the invitation is on his desk, and I think he will come either before or after the Brussels summit. So what next? What next, and I will conclude there, because I don't want to take too much of time, and I will answer the questions if there are any. But I think, we have to work together in a kind of request-driven, two-way street, because the point is not, NATO is not there to bring things, you know, and to teach the Africans how to do things. The Africans have to teach us a lot too. And I will take one example, you know, and I think I will finish on this note. It's Somalia, which is the biggest African Union operation to date, and Afghanistan for NATO. Those two operations have huge similarities, asymmetrical threats. Fight, you know, to support a central government vis-à-vis, you know, entities, you know, that are not united. On this, you know, we can sit at a table and exchange views, because there's a lot of problems we address together in different manners and where we can learn from each other. That's the way I would like, you know, this future NATO African Union cooperation to develop. And I will stop there, and I will be ready to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Mr. Kidani.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mohammed Jibril, and Ambassador Alessandro, President of the NATO Foundation Defense College, for inviting me to speak in this very important conference. Well, the topic that is given to me is about security and safe state in the Horn of Africa. I think I have slides. Can I take? Yes, please. So I'm not going to discuss about these conceptual issues. What is security? Definitely, when I say security, I'm talking about the state security and societal security, because most of the conflicts that we witness in the Horn of Africa are not coming from outside, but mostly they are internal. So it's good to include the internal issues as well, the political, economic, and other issues as security issues. So I'll be focusing on challenges that are facing the Horn of Africa in terms of you know, ensuring security and having safe state in that particular region. And then I'll be also looking at the strategic importance of the Horn, importance to Europe, the Gulf, and of course beyond, and then what can be done to at least rectify some of the challenges, security challenges, in ensuring safe state in the Horn of Africa. So if you look at, this is what you call the Horn of Africa. Basically, some people used to call it as the Greater Horn of Africa to include some countries. Traditionally, it's only Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Somalia that are known as Horn of Africa, but including Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, and Uganda is called Greater Horn of Africa. So I'll be using the Greater Horn of Africa. When I say Horn of Africa, I'm referring basically the 8 countries. So I will not go into details, history of this Horn of Africa for the sake of time, but I will be going directly to the security challenge in the Horn of Africa. Well, if you look at the Horn of Africa, it's full of diversity in terms of its geography, in terms of its culture, in terms of the population, in terms of history, even in terms of politics. And this diversified characteristic feature of that particular region has opened a way, or is considered as one major factor why that particular region of Africa is a hotbed for conflicts. And again, because of this diversification, it also opens up a room for other external actors to play around, or for proxy politics. In this case, we have this, if you look at the nature of the conflicts in the Horn of Africa, especially within that scope that I delimited, well, there are 3 main types of conflicts. The first conflict is intra-state conflict within societies, within one state. And then the second phase is interstate, between one country and another country, between two or more. And you have also, I said, there is also international external intervention. So as a result of that external intervention beyond the Horn of Africa, there is also another level of conflict. So I will not be dealing with the details of intrastate or interstate or beyond interstate conflicts, again, in the best interest of time. But I will be going directly to, well, what are the problems, say, for instance, of the interstate, rather intrastate conflicts? Well, one is as you can see on the, this one, you have poor governance. So if you have poor governance, it means that there is no room for participatory democracy or participatory government. Then the option is most of the time coercion, using force, and then marginalization of some communities. And following the marginalization, you will have discontent as opposed to, as I said, persuasion and deliberation towards democracy. Then the end result is, the flourishment of armed insurgents groups that challenge the authority of the central government. That is the real characteristic feature, one characteristic feature of countries in the Horn of Africa. And again, this leads to another problem, that is mutual destabilization. If you look at the Horn of Africa, say for instance, if you take Ethiopia at the center of that region, and then if you look at the whole 360-degree border area, on the other side of the border, there are similar communities who speak the same language, who have a similar face, and then, frontiers are not controlled by central governments, so the marginalized or the peripheral communities straddle boundaries without any limit. And that leads into what? That leads into, say for instance, if there is a problem in Ethiopia, then it will be a good opportunity for the neighboring countries, one or two or more, to play around because of, loose integration. And again, this also opens up a room for external forces to, to have this, to implement what you call this proxy politics, so that they can fulfill their interest. Well, again, look now what is happening in the Horn of Africa. We have about 7 countries who are building or having ports or building port projects and military bases. So this is also very important when it comes to the problems of this particular region. So what are the challenges of this region? One is, the challenge is creating sense of national identity. If you don't finish the nation building process, it's very difficult to bring about a safe state whereby you have integration, regional integration, especially regional market integration. So this unfinished job, completing this unfinished job is one challenge that is facing the Horn of Africa at large. And then establishing regional integration, focusing on building regional economic market is also another challenge. And then ensuring regional interests through developing negotiation and persuasion power of that particular region is also very important, especially compared with, I don't know, we can call it competition or we can label it the other way around, but looking just on this map, it tells you something. So now, the strategic importance, especially to Europe, the Gulf and beyond. By the way, the Horn of Africa is located south of the fractured southern neighborhood of Europe itself. So it's also telling. So you have, despite weak standing of these countries in the Horn of Africa, well, it is, the location itself controls passage from the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Political control of these countries by other external countries or actors permits logistical access to other countries in both North and Central Africa, as well as the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East. One of the major sea lanes of communication and choke points in the world is also found in this particular area. Look, sorry, the bold lines, this one. If you start from Straits of Malacca, and if you want to go to Europe, maybe to Italy, okay, there is one choking point at Bab el-Mandeb, at the Horn of Africa. So it's a major sea route. And if you look at, oh, sorry, oh my goodness, but hopefully I will have one or two. Well, 20% of the world trade route is through this Horn of Africa. And if one study, let me bring this map. Which one you prefer as Europeans? From Straits of Malacca via Cape Town to Rotterdam, or through the Red Sea? I mean, it's telling, it's obvious in terms of even cost. If you go via Cape Town, it will add 74% of the distance, and in terms of cost, is in millions. So, finally, how do we cope? Well, I have a little bit maybe different suggestion. You know, if you look at the Horn of Africa, the main actors in terms of conflict are both Ethiopia and Eritrea. So for me, we have to start from the regional sub-level to bring about cessation of hostilities, and then after the required security cooperation and market integration. So the first step should be to, you know, avoiding hostility between Ethiopia and Eritrea. How? Well, I mean, it's very difficult to discuss it right now. But that is very important and priority. For us, me as an Ethiopian, even for Eritreans on the other side, this is the priority this time. But how do we do it? Well, in cooperation with our partners, regional or international. It can be NATO or EU, AU, but that is very important. Second, again, there is also an extension to this, the Nile issue. That should be also solved. Because, you know, the dispute, the proxies, internal or, transboundary conflicts are revolving around this issue. Even the power alliances of the Gulf states and beyond. These are the basic issues. So that is what I want to say. Otherwise, I can state so many
Thank you
proposals.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the session is 1 hour and a half. We have already consumed 1 hour now, so we still have half an hour. I'm going to give 20 minutes for the floor first, if there are any questions. The last 10 minutes will be given to the panelists, and then just 2 or 3 minutes to wrap up the whole session, you know. So any questions from the floor, please? Please, in the back. If you kindly can mention your name.
My name is Pietro Scuricini. I was just the chief of, for a very short time, unfortunately, the chief of bilateral cooperation in defense area. with African countries. My question is, I heard most of the speakers speaking about cooperation with China, Russia, United States, and European Union, while, as far as I know, most of the financial bilateral cooperation are with singular countries, European countries, not European Union. So just a clarification, which are the real relationship between African countries and European countries. Thanks a lot.
Okay, next question, please. Ms. Hafida here.
Thank you very much. I would like to congratulate the panelists. It was all of them extremely interesting, but I have a question about the very last panelist. When he showed the map with the bases, the foreign bases in the Horn of Africa, I was struck by one figure. You have 5 Emirati bases in the region. I have been counting them on your graph. How come that such a small country, which has, I believe, no soldiers of Emirati origin, mainly foreigners in its own army, how come that they have that 5 military bases in the Horn of Africa? What for? And one thing, a global remark for everybody, we're all talking about peace, security, development, human development, but none of the panelists, neither today nor yesterday, have been mentioning the role of women, the possibility of using or calling for that commodity, let's say. Women organization exist, women like ICANN or WASL or other are trying their best to work for preventing extremism and violence, and I think they can be also a partner or an actor in promoting peace and security and stability. Thank you.
Next question, please. Right there.
Thank you very much, Alessandro Politi. I wanted just to ask the panelists, you have a constellation of major, at least regional leaders in Africa. You have Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, and probably a couple of others. How are they able or unable to put together the forces in order to assist the African Union in a significant way? If you treat Africa as a whole, it is quite evident that these regional leaders need somehow to interact significantly. Thank you very much.
Okay, next question, please. Right here.
Many thanks, for the presentation, and to the panelists. I am Vice Admiral Marimé, formerly, teacher of defense and security policy at our I Defense Institute here in Rome. I heard many times, the word of peacekeepers or something like that, whereas, the context of the major conflicts require, peace enforcing capabilities. I don't know if it's something that has already been treated here, but I never heard, this concept of capacity building in peace, enforcing. And the other one is, I worked in 2005 at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington. We were in Atlanta for the concept of responsibility to protect. I know what happened in Libya when the mission passed, from a humanitarian mission became, regime change mission. But is this concept dead, or there is, some way out for this?
Okay.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
Basir Rayet, Crisis Management Specialist. My question goes to Dr. Groepelar and Monsieur Soulan. Dr. Groepelar, the 9/11 attack actually should be characterized as the first hybrid attack, perhaps an economic attack employing terrorist tactics, so we should always have as many economists as possible. In that context, my question is focusing on Africa and specifically wildlife. Perhaps traditional Chinese medicine is one of the biggest threats against the wildlife, and these days economists are pricing wildlife, and obviously when you take the wildlife, then you have open land, and then probably farming, then urbanization, so we're losing it, and that contributes to global warming. So I was wondering if you saw any pattern or any relation or correlation between arms trade stemming from China over the last 30 years, and then perhaps decline in wildlife, any effects of sorts. Thank you. And Monsieur Soula, my question is specifically regarding crisis management and disaster response. Are there any initiatives in the works to help support the AU in that respect? Thank you.
Any other questions, please? Right there.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for wonderful briefings. First, a statement. I'm Hassan Aygün, former political advisor of commanders in Lisbon and Naples operational headquarters. And from the very beginning, I was part of the NATO African Union engagement. In 2005, our first visit to Addis Ababa was very difficult because the African Union people would not like to be seen side by side with NATO people. So the first meeting was held in a hotel room, and everybody was nervous. 2-3 years later, Deputy Assistant Secretary General Maurice Jochems, Ambassador Jochems, was speaking at African Union Peace and Security Council. So we moved ahead really fast, despite Libya crisis, despite Madame Zuma's objections to NATO's policies. But let me thank Michel Soula, because for 10 years he's been working on it, and we have covered a long distance. Even during those crises in Libya and Madame Zuma's chairmanship, people behind closed doors were still talking. So it is a one-way street, and it's going for better relations. I'm now interested in China's presence in Africa, because I heard two conflicting views. African Union, Mr. Maro said Chinese tentacles. And I heard on the other side that China is offering jobs, employment to the African people. Both of them could be correct. So what is next? What does the African Union think about it? Will China have a niche in relations and future of Africa, or can it be excluded?
Okay. Thank you. Other questions? Okay, last question there.
Qualcuno può tradurre la mia domanda perché non sono in grado di farla in inglese? Ottimo. Allora, in Cina, anzi la Cina ha distribuito circa 2,5 miliardi di dollari in Africa solo in infrastrutture, giusto? E tra le quali case. Nella sola Angola il primo lotto è di 2.800 appartamenti, di cui venduti solo 200, perché gli africani non hanno modo di accedere in alcun modo a un credito bancario. Volevo sapere se l'Africa si rende conto, a fronte del fatto che la Cina è riuscita a far piovere quest'anno con 5.000 miliardi di litri d'acqua, se la comunità estera è al corrente del fatto che questa è una colonizzazione fatta in piccoli passi. Nelle scuole africane si studia il cinese, ma le strade non si mangiano. Fine la domanda. La domanda è stessa.
The investment that China has done in infrastructures in several countries in Africa are a sort of new colonization that is continuously increasing in the continent. Is this perceived by the African countries?
Okay, so I will give 2 minutes to each panelist. We have a basket full of questions to respond. If the question is addressed specifically to a certain panelist, he can respond to it. Otherwise, he can choose whatever question he would like to respond to. We have about 80 questions here. So please, let me start with Mr. Sola.
Thank you, Chair. I will try to, it's okay for the sound? Okay. I will try to be brief. So first of all, to Madame, on the women's role, I don't know if you were out of the room, but I mentioned women, you know, and I mentioned that Ambassador Diop was in Rome, you know, a few weeks ago to preside over our talks, you know, and she's, as you know, the special representative of the chair for women, peace and security, and I mentioned the fact that women can be a big factor in peace and stability, and in NATO, that's one of the main lines of action these days. We have a special rep for that with an ambassador dealing for women, peace and security, children in arms conflict. So that's really a concern. So on this, I wanted to redress this, because it's very important, and I completely agree with you 200%. On the forces to the disposal of the African Union from different African countries, this is a thing that is a process, you know, in the making, and it's clear that the African standby force has known all the difficulties it has known. It's because you need, you know, all the countries to talk to each other and to provide the forces. But on this, it's very difficult for NATO to be a lessons giver to Africa, because for NATO, we have the same problems, you know, and if you were the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, you know, he has headaches, you know, to find the forces, you know, to populate the different NATO's operations. So it's not an issue that's specific to Africa, and that's where I say we have a lot to exchange between each other, because we have the same problems in fourth generation these days. So, of course, the African standby force is younger than NATO, but still, it's the same problems. Nations have more and more difficulties to provide forces to an international organization. We see that also with the building of the European defense, you know, where you have the same problems of fourth generation. So it's a general issue all over the world. On the capacity building in peacekeeping, you know, it's true, we are doing things. I explained that, you know, we are doing some planning courses, we are doing mobile education training team to help the Africans, you know, to be able to do peacekeeping in their own countries, you know, through the African Union. At this moment, we do this training with the African Union and the regional economic communities. And I think, you know, we have a parity in our trainings of people from the African Union and people from the regional economic communities. So I think that's the right way to proceed, and that's the thing the African Union wanted. On the responsibility...
No, you don't have to respond to all questions, because you won't leave anything to the other panelists.
But I just have some points to say on each, maybe not all the questions. You know.
Okay, try to make it quick, please.
But I'll make it quick, but I think so I will leave the responsibility to protect. But then, you know, my friend Hassan, you know, thanks so much for your kind words. But you mentioned, you know, Ambassador Yoakum's address in front of the Peace and Security Council, and you are correct, but that was before the Libya crisis. And of course, what you said illustrates the ups and downs of the relationship with the African Union, but at this moment, as I say, we are in an up. So we have to seize the opportunity, and that's why I think a seminar like here is very important. What I want to say also on this Libya thing, because I have not talked about it and it's important, is that, you know, during the Libya crisis, Chairperson Ping came twice to address the North Atlantic Council. You know, and the words there were not acrimonious, you know, it was more a kind of exchange of views between two organizations.
Okay, Mr. Sola.
So that's very, I think, important to underline, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Ms. Kedan, you have a specific question directed to you from Ms. Hafidis. You can respond to it.
Well, actually, the reason why we are having more than one army bases in one country, well, partially is due to the weakness of the countries in the region. And the other reason is, one way or the other, is because of, you know, some international concerns, say, fight against piracy is also an issue why these countries are coming together. And of course, basically what I would say is that because, you know, the region is not well integrated, is very weak, then countries prefer retailing their interest for the first buyer. That's what some of the countries are doing. Of course, it's very difficult also for other countries in the region, say for instance in Ethiopia, you don't have any any foreign army base. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mahari.
Yes, thank you. I would like to limit myself to the issue related to China. And I think China, to state it directly, China is welcomed in Africa. China is doing something that other partners didn't do for a long time. Only on delivery of roads, infrastructures, and related things, and also soft loans that are unconditional on strings that has been attached by others, like European Union is catching up now, aiming to establish, for example, bank specifically for investment in Africa. So they're welcomed, but the kind of image that Africa has about China and the kind of image the West depicts about China in Africa is different. So we have our own image. That doesn't mean there is no problem. As all partnership, there is a big problem with China. One of them is it's deflationary in terms of democratization. For democracy, it's good for delivery. But for democracy, it's affecting many countries. Now, add it with the anti-liberal democracy movements in Europe, in the US. We're afraid. Only European Union, for example, has a pedigree to push democracy. Historical background it has. We don't look for democracy from China, of course. We look for delivery from China. It was inspirational. There is no big contribution and service to human being than lifting 700 million people out of poverty in 3 decades. We take that lesson seriously. We want to encourage that. But at the same time, we don't want to do it at the expense of democracy. So we want European Union and others from the West to help us. And you're not able to help yourselves now in democracy. You're facing the biggest challenge. The second one point I want to raise, and in addition is just 1 minute, is on the issue of Emirati, UAE. In my opinion, there are 2 reasons. One, internal Middle Eastern war between the Saudi-led bloc and Iranian bloc is affecting their move there. The economists called UAE the little Sparta. It wants to establish more than it has, and it has to personalize that, to put personnel from other countries beyond Emirati, because the Emirates do not have sufficient human resource, like you said. But suffice to say, the absence of policy from the US under President Trump on the Middle East in general has allowed UAE to involve in Yemen and by proxy in these areas. So this is as outside, but Kidana has mentioned that it's also internally the weakness of our region to act against these moves by foreign forces.
Thank you. 2 minutes, Ms. Neuma. Would you like to respond to the issue of women, gender issue?
I think I'm not going to respond because I think there was an excellent answer by Mr. Sula. But I just very quickly want to talk to some of the questions that were directed at me. I perfectly agree with the statements that's been made about China. China is an incredibly important partner for Africa. And I actually do use the word partnership because there was a bit of a discussion yesterday about partnership. And absolutely, China is very, very important for delivery in Africa, but it is a very, very difficult actor. I think not only for Africa, I think globally, it's a difficult actor to deal with. And that comes back to the question about wildlife in particular. So China's actually introduced a ban on wildlife, on ivory, the ivory trade. The US followed suit. What we've actually found is that most ivory trade is coming through Europe, ironically, via the UK. So the decision by China to actually introduce a ban on wildlife trade, I think, signals something very important, which is China is actually listening to African concerns. Whether it is effective and whether it's actually effectively implementing a ban on wildlife. And there's very good evidence to show that it is actually using organized crime syndicates to get the ivory out of the country, and of course rhino horn as well. But often, in many respects, those final destinations are Japan, are Vietnam. So we have a conflation here of different issues. And African agency to engage on these issues are sometimes very, very limited. But nonetheless, what we do find is, I think, a receptive ear. I just very quickly want to talk about R2P. Is R2P dead? I sincerely hope not. But I think what is very, very concerning is the position that African leaders have taken on the ICC. And once again, this is not a unanimous decision. You know, this is not a unanimous position. There are actually very strong advocates in favor of the ICC in Africa. There are also very, very strong advocates anti the ICC. And we have to ask the question, why has that happened? And I think what's happened in Libya really has given the reason for that. Okay. May I just last on Europe?
Please, 1 minute, because we are short on time.
Sure. Who is Africa's partners in Europe? I think that is such an important question, and it's such an important question really for Africa as well. What does Brexit mean for the EU-Africa relationship? Because in many respects, some of those relationships are very bilateral relationships, and I think rightly so. So in the UK, Africa had a very strong champion in the European Union. There are other leaders, other European leaders that are trying to step up, Germany in particular. But I think we're entering a phase of real uncertainty. And with uncertainty also comes enormous opportunity, but also enormous responsibility. And what we really do need is very strong leadership. Okay. Strong leadership from Africa and strong leadership from Europe. Thank you.
Okay, the few minutes left. I would like to speculate on the future of African-European relationship in a completely different frame. It's within the frame what-if scenarios, you know. First, we are emphasizing state building in Africa. Whether since 1981, David Easton started talking about withering the state. It's a new age where the individual, non-state actors are the name of the game. Unfortunately, the system which we inherited after World War II has nothing to do with non-state actors. You won't find a word in the international law talking about individuals, while most of the events of today's world are talking about terrorists, illegal immigration, talking about human trafficking. These issues, our system, international system, is not equipped to deal with. So, talking about empowering the state in a tribal structured continent makes the mission more difficult. 2, the future of terrorism in Africa, especially if the black hole of Africa, Libya, all the efforts, let us assume that they fail. What's the future of terrorism? Libya has become a cradle of terrorism, while all brands of terrorists are convening in Libya, having accessibility to weapons, having accessibility to money, and it's a stateless society. There is no state there, you know. Future of terrorism, if you look at Daesh, ISIS today, or ISIL, the average age is between 15 to 25, while during Al-Qaeda, the average age was 25 to 35. Not only this, just 2 days ago, there was this documentary stating that there are 31,000 women pregnant under the control of Daesh today. And they are starting to prepare those little children to be future terrorists. You know. Just imagine connecting Daesh in Libya with Boko Haram in Nigeria, with the Shabab in Somalia. And this most expanding continent in the globe, what would be the future of that continent vis-a-vis the stability of Europe or the Mediterranean in general. Last but not least, we didn't talk at all about any potential of relationship between the European private sector and the African private sector. Africa is going to be the most expanding market in the globe. It will be exceeding 2 billion people, about 2.5 billion people by 2050. Isn't it in the interest of the private sector in both continents to establish something like Africa Fund, to start dealing with the problem as a grassroots, empowering those Africans instead of contracting with some militia leaders in Libya and some other places to keep those people inside Libya or inside any other African country. Guns alone will not solve the problem. We have now to choose between 3 paradigms of dealing between Africa and Europe. First paradigm is the paradigm of security. We are afraid of Africa. We are afraid of the illegal immigration. We are afraid. This is a gunboat policy. And there is a humanitarian paradigm. Those poor Africans, we can provide some humanitarian assistance. No, sorry, it's not a humanitarian issue. It's a political issue of first degree, because all those refugees and all those Africans who were forced to stay in Libya or elsewhere against their own will, they are potential terrorists. 3, there is a paradigm of need. We need Africa. Africa has the most diversified resources in the globe today. Africa has the skilled labor today in different African countries, while Europe is shrinking. So there is a room that we can join hands for the benefit of both countries. Unfortunately, the third paradigm did not approach it yet. Nobody is talking about it. We are the prisoners either of the first paradigm, we are afraid of Africa, or the second paradigm, the humanitarian issue. Isn't it about time for the benefit and the interest of both continents that we started talking about some sort of economic integration, that we contemplate each other on both continents? I would like to seize this opportunity to, on your behalf, to thank the panelists for well-done presentations, and thank you very much for listening.
Good one, good summary. Really, I like it.
Thank you.
Clearly that in the past 2-3 years since you left, you have been working on the scenario building a lot.
Yeah.
Only people who are concerned about the future are engaged on scenarios.
Yes,
so
yes.
Which I always do.
Please, a second of attention. Please take these 5 minutes for a rest, because then we will have the closing remarks of the Defense Minister of Mauritania. So please don't disperse, because he's just coming back to the conference room. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am very happy. I have the honor to introduce our last speaker, who is a guest of the foundation for the second time, Mr. Mamadou Diallo Batia. He is the Minister of Defense of the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, and I'm sure that after this very interesting tour around African problems, and we heard about the Horn of Africa, I'm sure that the Minister has very interesting things to tell us. Monsieur le Ministre, vous avez la parole.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier Son Excellence l'ambassadeur président de la Fondation de nous avoir invités pour participer à ces discussions-là depuis hier. Et c'est toujours avec plaisir que nous venons ici pour discuter avec vous de questions très importantes et qui interpellent naturellement tous ceux qui aiment l'Afrique et les relations entre l'Afrique et l'Europe de façon particulière. Je pense que les différentes interventions que nous avons écoutées ce matin et même hier ont eu à poser de façon très claire la problématique de la démographie et les enjeux par rapport à Donc je disais que les interventions que nous avons écoutées ce matin, ainsi que celles qu'il y a eu hier, ont eu à poser de façon claire les enjeux de la démographie et de la nécessité de repenser de façon pragmatique et intelligente la coopération entre les pays européens et les pays africains de façon générale pour une meilleure intégration et naturellement pour une grande mobilisation pour faire face aujourd'hui aux problèmes qui sont communs, qui sont le problème de l'immigration et de la sécurité de façon générale. Je pense aussi que vous comprendrez que, en tant que ministre de la Défense, que je sois préoccupé au quotidien par les problèmes de sécurité et de défense. Et naturellement, je pense que la meilleure contribution que je peux modestement faire, c'est de vous parler un peu de la région de laquelle je viens, ce que nous sommes en train de faire. Et je pense que cela pourra enrichir tout ce que vous avez dit par rapport aux efforts communs de coopération et d'intégration entre nos différents pays. Alors moi, je viens de Mauritanie. C'est un pays qui se situe dans la bande du Sahel et qui, naturellement, les années 2002-2009, a connu une situation sécuritaire extrêmement difficile. Parce que je pense que dans leur planification, les forces terroristes ont décidé que le Sahel va être non seulement une zone dans laquelle ils vont opérer, mais même que cela devrait être un refuge pour eux. Parce que à chaque fois qu'ils ont été sévèrement attaqués par ailleurs, c'est là où ils essayent de retrouver leurs forces. Ce qui fait que s'ils ne sont pas combattus à ce niveau, on ne va jamais régler définitivement les problèmes de sécurité. Et en 2009 donc, ils ont eu à attaquer très fortement notre pays. Nous avons connu beaucoup de pertes, une situation difficile. On a perdu des militaires, il y avait le terrorisme dans les différentes zones, même les zones urbaines. Ce qui a amené la Mauritanie à réagir de façon évidente, parce que tout simplement, il en allait de la disparition de notre pays et de l'installation justement des forces terroristes à son niveau. Ce qui fait que nous avons, depuis 2009, procédé par une démarche très simple et qui, aujourd'hui, Dieu merci, a donné des résultats dont nous sommes absolument fiers. Et cette démarche a reposé sur 3 points essentiellement. Et je pense que cela peut servir partout ailleurs. Le premier de ces points, c'est de compter sur nous-mêmes. Il est clair qu'on ne peut pas défendre un pays, on ne peut pas faire de la sécurité dans un pays si on ne compte pas sur ses propres forces. Il n'y a aucune force étrangère qui, malgré toute sa bonne volonté, ne peut venir à bout d'une situation sécuritaire dans un pays si les enfants et le peuple de ce pays-là, justement, ne prend pas en charge sa destinée. Naturellement, compter sur soi-même ne veut pas dire qu'on n'a pas besoin de coopération. On coopère avec tous les pays amis qui nous aident dans ce cadre-là. Et nous avons une coopération aussi bien bilatérale que multilatérale assez importante avec tous les pays voisins d'abord, les pays européens, les différentes organisations internationales, l'Union africaine, l'OTAN. Mais en tout cas, la philosophie de base de notre démarche a été de compter sur nous-mêmes. Cela nous a demandé un grand effort, aussi bien sur le plan budgétaire que sur le plan, sur le plan humain. Mais aujourd'hui, nous défendons nos frontières et assurons la sécurité de notre pays sans aucune troupe étrangère. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qui nous a beaucoup aidé dans la mise en œuvre de notre politique sécuritaire. En plus donc de compter sur soi-même, nous avons aussi investi beaucoup dans le contrôle et l'observation de notre territoire. Nous avons un territoire de plus d'1 million de kilomètres carrés. C'était un territoire donc où les bandes de trafiquants, de drogue et de tout genre passaient. Et aujourd'hui, avec l'investissement que nous avons fait sur le plan de l'observation, nous sommes à mesure, en temps réel, de savoir ce qui se passe sur notre territoire, sur chaque mètre carré de notre territoire. C'est ce qui explique qu'aujourd'hui, on a pu dérouter régulièrement les bandes de trafiquants et naturellement, on a pu intervenir à chaque fois qu'il y avait une menace que l'on sentait et ça, c'est un élément extrêmement important dans la stratégie que nous avons mise en place. Le troisième élément de notre stratégie, cela a été la réorganisation de notre armée pour pouvoir s'adapter justement à la nouvelle situation et aux nouvelles menaces, ce qui explique que nous avons beaucoup investi dans la mobilité et le prédispositionnement dans les différents points de passage, ce qui nous a permis d'avoir des rendements très importants. Donc aujourd'hui, notre pays est en sécurité. Cela fait plus de 6 ans ou 7 ans que nous n'avons pas eu une seule attaque terroriste en Mauritanie et qu'il n'y a pas eu une seule attaque terroriste qui est partie de Mauritanie pour attaquer notre pays. C'est naturellement une situation fragile qui nous demande beaucoup d'efforts et on n'est jamais à l'abri de ces choses-là. Mais en tout cas, c'est quelque chose dont nous sommes satisfaits et qui naturellement a été l'objet de la politique qui a été mise en place dans notre pays ces 10 dernières années. Mais malgré tout, nous restons dans une région extrêmement fragile où il y a de lourdes menaces. La situation en Libye, qui est une grande préoccupation, et tant qu'elle n'est pas réglée, elle influera forcément sur la situation dans le Sahel et en Europe et en Méditerranée, je pense qu'on l'a dit. La situation au Mali reste très préoccupante parce qu'après plusieurs années d'efforts, il n'y a pas encore une issue au terrorisme, il n'y a pas encore une issue pour le retour à une situation normale et vous savez tous qu'on continue chaque jour, malheureusement, d'enregistrer des attaques aussi bien au nord du Mali, maintenant au centre du Mali, et cela ne touche plus les forces armées maliennes seulement, mais y compris les forces des Nations Unies qui sont stationnées au Mali. Cette situation se développe au sud à tel point qu'elle impacte le Niger, le Burkina Faso, le Tchad, bien sûr la jonction se faisant au niveau du Tchad avec les terroristes du Boko Haram. Ce qui fait que c'est une situation régionale dans le Sahel très préoccupante et qui, naturellement, si elle n'est pas prise en charge et réglée le plus rapidement possible, va continuer également d'influencer aussi bien la Mauritanie que le Maghreb, que la Méditerranée, ce qui fait que beaucoup d'efforts doivent être faits à ce niveau. Et c'est justement pour répondre à cette situation qu'au niveau de la Mauritanie, nous avons développé une très grande coopération avec les pays voisins. D'abord, coopération bilatérale qui est extrêmement poussée avec le Sénégal, avec le Mali, pays avec lesquels nous avons des manœuvres communes, nous avons des patrouilles communes, nous avons même des droits de poursuite. Et donc une très bonne coopération bilatérale, mais aussi une coopération multilatérale dans la mesure où il faut intervenir au niveau de l'ensemble des pays de la zone. Et c'est ce qui a amené le dernier point dont je vais vous parler, qui est la création du G5 Sahel. Le G5 Sahel est une création pragmatique des États du Sahel. Et l'idée, bien sûr, est née en Mauritanie, en Nouakchott, il y a quelques années. Et nous avons donc pu convaincre nos amis du Mali, du Burkina Faso, du Niger et du Tchad de contribuer à mutualiser les efforts pour pouvoir de façon durable combattre justement le terrorisme au niveau de toute la zone et chercher à l'éradiquer définitivement au niveau du Nord Mali. C'est une jeune organisation qui a eu un développement remarquable. Si vous suivez l'actualité, vous savez que c'est l'une des rares organisations en très peu de temps qui a engagé les Nations Unies, engagé l'Union européenne. Et il y a eu plusieurs réunions déjà au niveau de New York, de Bruxelles, pour justement appuyer cette organisation. Et la France joue un rôle important dans le soutien à cette organisation. Elle est en train de s'implanter, de monter en puissance. Et au jour d'aujourd'hui, les différents bataillons qui le composent dans les différents pays sont constitués et sont pratiquement opérationnels. Naturellement, cela demande beaucoup de moyens et d'équipements qui sont en train d'être mobilisés. Vous savez que les promesses ne sont pas aussi rapides qu'on les fait, qu'on les réalise, ce qui fait qu'il y a eu un peu de retard par rapport à cela. Mais en tout cas, dans l'avenir, je pense que nous serons à mesure de mobiliser une force qui comprendra les militaires des différents États, qui va intervenir de façon ponctuelle pour la sécurisation des zones centre et ouest du Mali, mais à terme pour pouvoir engager des actions plus vigoureuses contre le terrorisme. C'est un peu cette philosophie de base qui a fait un peu notre politique au niveau de la Mauritanie, de compter sur nous-mêmes, qui est aussi à l'origine de la création de cette force. Et en plus de cela, le G5 Sahel, qui est une organisation sous-régionale, coopère naturellement beaucoup avec l'Union africaine, notamment le Conseil de paix et de sécurité, et elle opère aujourd'hui dans le cadre des résolutions bien approuvées par le Conseil de sécurité. Voilà à peu près la situation qui reste difficile et préoccupante, mais je pense qu'avec l'aide de tout le monde, nous arriverons donc à pouvoir passer à une meilleure situation. En dehors de cela, nous coopérons bien sûr dans le cadre des Nations Unies, et la Mauritanie, malgré que ça ne soit pas un grand pays ni une grande armée, a quand même envoyé plus d'1 millier de militaires en Centrafrique qui aujourd'hui opèrent dans le cadre de forces de paix et de sécurité. Voilà, Monsieur le Président, ce que je voulais partager avec vous, tout en réitérant naturellement les engagements ou les recommandations que vous avez données ici. Il faut vraiment qu'on repense l'avenir de la relation entre l'Europe, l'Afrique de façon générale et l'Union africaine. Bon, les différentes difficultés que l'on va rencontrer, et les différentes sensibilités des différents pays ne doivent pas, de mon point de vue, résister à cette volonté de combattre ce fléau commun, parce que si on n'y arrivait pas, on va beaucoup retarder le développement de nos pays. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre, pour votre contribution à ce débat très utile, très intéressant. Et certainement, votre partie de l'Afrique est très sensible, est aussi très importante pour nous, pour l'Europe et pour le reste du monde. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we are at the end of our works because you see in the program that the President of Guinea is scheduled, but he has been retained in his country by pressing internal problems. That's what we have been told by the Embassy of Guinea. So, you know, he will remain, he's still in Conakry. We had invited him because he was the last chairperson of the African Union, but you know how these things are. And of course, the head of state may have other pressing issues to deal with. So I want to thank everybody. You, Mr. Minister, the moderators, some of them are old friends like Mr. Jibril, all the speakers, Hafida, you have been great. And I think this has been an interesting conference, a new kind of conference, if you like, because it's very difficult to have something on Africa trying to do everything at the same time. It's a big continent, and we have to choose something that you think you can discuss in 1 or 2 days. So we have tried hard to do that and to have the best possible contributors and the best possible speakers. And I think we have achieved, I may say, I'm very satisfied of the outcome of the debate. We even had the strike of the air control yesterday, and somebody had to come by train. So, I mean, everybody has been very helpful. Anyway, at the end of this, I would like to thank also my collaborators in the foundation, the director, Alessandro Politi first, and all these young girls who are there. So, an applause for them, please. So, thank you very much. I think that for the time being, enjoy Piazza di Spagna.
Thank you very much.
Voilà, très bien.
Merci beaucoup.
Non, vous avez très bien dit les choses qu'il faut dire.
Merci beaucoup. C'était un plaisir.
Ça, c'est assez mystérieux, le président de la Guinée. Nous avait confirmé par écrit